I want to thank the Center for Kurdish Progress for organizing this panel on Kurdistan region at a crossroads. And I'll start by introducing the panelists. Dr. Dara Salam is a teaching fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at SAS University of London. He's written on Middle East politics and political theory. Dastan Jasim is a research fellow at the Giga Institute for Middle East Studies, and she's a doctoral student at the Friedrich Alexander University at Erlangen-Nuremberg, and a member of the Giga doctoral program. And she has also written on Kurdish politics. My name is Megan Connelly. I'll be the moderator today. I am a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Regional and International Studies at the American University of Iraq in Soleimani. And I have focused primarily on sub-regional political institutions. So welcome to this panel. I'm just going to introduce the topic, and then we'll move ahead with the questions for the panelists. So over the past year has been tumultuous for the Kurdistan region of Iraq. In addition to pre-existing financial constraints from the previous 6 years, budget cuts and suspensions for the federal government, the COVID-19 pandemic and the collapse of oil prices sent the Kurdistan region's economy again into a tailspin. Transfers from the federal government to pay civil servants were again cut, and the region was unable to pay civil servants their full salaries, even as the new government under Masroor Barzani had initiated a reform program designed to shore up revenues and improve public services. Public discontent was again manifested on the streets in the form of large protests over the summer and winter months, not only in Soleimani, but also in the KDP's zone of influence where protests had typically been suppressed. The protests and subsequent crackdowns brought to the surface escalating conflict between the Kurdistan regional government and its citizens as well. And this instability comes at a time when conflict between the KRI's dominant parties also became more destabilizing, with new party leadership and conflicts within the government. And the government also contends with the presence of the PKK, and foreign powers such as Turkey intervene more aggressively in regional affairs. While most analysis has looked primarily at high-level politics, in this panel, we intend to examine how the relationship between the regional government and civil society has been affected by these external and internal political conflicts. So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us. And I'm going to start with some questions to the panelists. And Dastan, I think I'm going to start with you, Dara, and then I'm going to move to Dastan just because that's the order you appear on my screen. So my first question is, how have the Kurdistan region partisan and institutional structures historically shaped public space in the Kurdistan region of Iraq? And specifically, how have these structures defined Kurdish civil society and opposition over time?
Thank you, Megan, for this. So first, I would like to start with the definition of public space. What do you mean by public space? So very briefly, I understand by public space the kind of space that citizens mainly and society participate. So it could cover many different or various forms of action and presentations and performances. So for example, it covers media, communicative action, street protests and demonstrations, and many other kind of public participation by citizens and society. So the public space as such emerged in Kurdistan as a result of the destruction of the Ba'ath regime's institutions and apparatuses. So basically after 1991 popular uprising. And it grew as an organic space where people's action and contribution were crucial in sustaining and developing it. So the public space or sphere was characterized by the increasing presence of media in different formats, in which many parts of society could express their opinions and form different associations and parties. In one of the definitions of public space, or actually some scholars would describe it as a civil society. So political parties can be part of this civil society. So if we, for example, refer to Gramsci, he defines public civil society as actually including political parties as well. So in the beginning, the associations that have already existed were political party dominated ones. That when I'm talking about the beginning, so I'm talking about after the 1991. So basically, I mean the political party associations were mainly the main ones, and they acted as civil society organizations. So for example, students, youth, workers, teachers, and women's associations. However, these kind of associations, which were mainly controlled and led by political parties, could not be seen as civil society organizations as such. The reason for that, because they don't constitute the non-state space that could act as pressure groups or society's own voice vis-a-vis the authority. Because what I understand by civil society in this case is very much a contested space that the public always wanted to claim, and political parties also try to occupy and infiltrate through their various organizations, and in some cases led to the dysfunctionality and the diminishment of civil society as a result of this kind of mix. So basically, I mean, there is a dialectical relationship if we try to define civil society and the public space as such. There's a dialectical relationship between the political parties' efforts to control this space and the society's struggle to create a public space which can be used to criticize, monitor, and hold authorities to account. So this is very briefly what I would actually see the public space in the beginning, in its formation in the Kurdistan region after 1991. But the second point, which I would like actually to say, if I have time, is that is to know that the kind of political authority we are talking about in the Kurdistan region, because the political authority in Kurdistan is actually divided over two centers of power, namely over two political parties. And this comes down to two political elites that are represented by two powerful families. So in this case, the nature of political power is what I would argue is personalized. And what I mean by this is if we put it into context, if we put it in the context of a wider Middle East region, we see that actually most of the states in the Middle East region in their beginning, in their formations, were driven by anti-colonial nationalist projects. And they consisted of a blend of the European notion of nation states and an autocratic rule. So basically the common theme among these post-colonial states was the paradigmatic nature of their political rule, which were dominated by a political party, an elite, and finally a leader and his family, who resided at the top of the power hierarchy. So this political reality, I think, is a political crisis represented in the personalization of the state. And this has roots in the European history of absolute monarchs. And basically, that goes back to the history of, if you go back to the 17th and 16th and 17th century in Europe, where the absolute monarchs claimed divine rights to rule, and when the monarchs declared that I am the state. So this is where actually we can trace the kind of the formation of state as such, or the formation of political authority in the wider Middle East region, and we see the kind of replication of that in the Kurdistan region as well, and how that affected the formation of the public space. But I don't want to take too much time, I mean, from Dastan as well, but maybe I will come back to this point later on.
Yeah, we could definitely come back to that. Now, over time, though, you know, you're discussing the establishment of partisan hegemony over public space, but over time, you know, we've seen the emergence of social media. We've seen, you know, the emergence of independent news outlets after, you know, after 2005. You know, this has increased over time. So, Dastan, I wonder if you could follow up on this and discuss how civil society has changed since you know, particularly since the first wave of protests in 2011, and how the government has responded to this, particularly over the past several years.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to the Center for Kurdish Progress for managing and organizing this, and thanks for everyone for being here. Yes, Dara was already giving an intro to the very decisive, especially 90s, when the system that we have today was manifested, especially between these two parties. And yeah, I mean, we should also not forget that one of the first happenings of this de facto autonomy that emerged in 1991 was you know, several years of internal bloodshed between these two parties, a civil war between these two parties. And this is the context in which we also have to see the media world, because in the 90s, you had the time, obviously, of oil for food program, of the sanctions, of extreme poverty, of lack of access to media, to information. Even if people would have criticism towards different things, they couldn't really communicate it to each other in this big space that we have now. But following the 2000s, following the implementation of internet access in overall Iraq, and especially the Kurdistan region, and the regime change and all of that, you see that really a new oppositional space emerged. And further than that, in the late 2000s, we see that there is much more communication between the Kurdistan region and the civic space of the Kurdistan region, and on the other side, the diaspora. So basically, the millions of people that fled Kurdistan region in, let's say, the 70s and 80s especially, but also the 90s, and who, you know, watched TV and who were, you know, frightened with the developments, and who were maybe critical, and they were in the West and they had access to all kinds of communication. They were now able to communicate with the people, with their own people in Kurdistan region. So this is the context of the late 2000s, in which movements like the Goran movement were mainly influenced, where all of these people that come from these generations, many people that have been inside these parties, but then grew to be more critical towards these parties, people that you know, were engaged in the struggle against Saddam Hussein, where all of these people came together and were all of a sudden able to communicate with each other what they don't think is okay. And out of this context, we had, in the same time as there was the Arab Spring, as you said, in 2010, 2011, there was also the Kurdish movement, the Kurdish protests that were happening in the big cities, but especially in Slimani. And in this time, we see that all of this communication, all of this oppositional thought that was emerging in this time really came into practice, but also was cracked down violently. But still, from this momentum, the Goran movement was back then able to get a great number of seats, become an oppositional party, and to really lead in what they still call the golden age of, you know, parliamentary opposition in the Kurdistan region from 2009 to 2013. There has been some change, there has been some progress in this time, but as we all know, from especially from 2014 on, from the whole issue with ISIS, from the financial crisis on, and especially from all of the emergent and growing violence against oppositionals, the situation has become much and much more harder. And while you had a time back then where people were oppositional but still organized in a party, in a movement, or like Dara said, in associations that were sometimes really old, and very well known, in the last years you see that people do not even believe these movements anymore, that people do not believe the Goran movement, the opposition anymore. People don't believe the associations anymore. Also, we have a huge bulge. We have much more young people that, don't believe in any of these organizations and that are oppositional, that have a lot of criticism to say, and that are in a very precarious situation, and that are not really asking for reform anymore, but some of them really asking for a complete system change. And that is met with utmost violence that we have seen last year, as you said, in December during the protest, that we have seen right now in the cases with Badinan prisoners. And so we have to see that while oppositional thought had, a good time in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the situation for oppositional thought and the relation between the state and oppositional groups and people who think in an oppositional way has worsened and become much more violent.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Dastan. I just want to take this opportunity because it looks like almost everybody's here that's going to be here. So please feel free to ask questions. We're going to go to a Q&A in the second half of this. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I'll address those later in the talk. But yeah, so a couple of the things that you brought up, one of them is the issue with the opposition political parties, and you said that it does sound that people don't believe in them anymore. And it seems to me that there's always a conflict with opposition parties in these types of polities where they have to decide whether they want to be in the government and actually interact with the parties in power, or remain opposition organizing on the street, or just as opposition parties in parliament where they might have less influence. And Goran has chosen to do the former and has not been very effective in doing this. And the dominant parties have set clear limits on what Goran can do. It is clearly not established rules that can rein in the executive. It is as a partner in a power sharing system in which everybody gets a share, but you might not be able to effectuate a reform policy that is that affects the status quo. So with that, and I think you touched on this, Dastan, but I'm going to move to my next question because I think it's I think we've seen a lot over the past year, particularly with this government in response to protests, and that there have been changing strategies when it comes to suppressing protests or co-opting protests. But it seems to be that the government used to use, or the political parties used to use, assassinations and these sort of coercive tactics to suppress or discourage protests. And now it seems like they're still doing this, but they're moving towards more legal strategies. I'm wondering if you can discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, I can try to just bring the example of the current Badinan cases, for example, that we have. So in the last months, there has been several cases against activists and journalists, among them people like Sherwan Sherwani, and cases against them for very specific, or a specific type of reason, specific type of accusation, which is very vague at the same time, and which is setting a good example for what the kind of approach in the last year is. So one of the accusations that they get for being for doing their journalistic work and for communicating and stuff like that is that they are you know, the whole oppositional sector and the whole sector of also where media can happen and where journalists can work and all that kind of stuff is happening in a let's say in a space that is outside the conventional space of journalism. So you don't really have classic independent media where, you know, a journalist could work and then they could, you know, do their research and then publish something and, you know, create some critical discourse. Basically, every bit of media is owned by some party at the end of the day, or some business person that thinks they are oppositional. And the people that are really oppositional on the other side, they do not belong to any of this. So they have to, you know, find other channels in which they can communicate, in which they can gather information, in which they can publish information. And that is happening through social media. And what is happening now is that on the one side, the government and the ruling class is restricting these spaces in which oppositional thought and journalistic thought is happening. But then on the other side, they take that precisely as a reason to criminalize them. And they tell them, well, you're not part of the official system. You know, you're not part of the Journalist Association, Journalist Workers Union. So you're not regarded as journalists. And this is exactly what is happening. And basically, you're pushing people out of the public space. You're pushing people out of the social space. And then when they're trying to find mechanisms to still work, to still be able to have a discourse in this kind of system, you're taking these mechanisms and you're criminalizing them. Also, another accusation is, you know, calling journalists that do not belong to this media system and that work through social media and stuff like that, calling them activists. So you're criminalizing being an activist, when at the same time in every, you know, working democracy, everyone being, you know, a researcher or a journalist or a politician can at the same time be an activist. That's perfectly normal. You're a citizen at the end of the day. But even that is criminalized. So what we see is a perversion really of the language of developed democracies, a perversion of that into a direction where people are systematically criminalized. And what they are doing in a lack of possibilities is being framed as something that is, you know, criminalized at the end of the day.
Yeah, Dara, I'm wondering, because on one hand, we're seeing this crackdown, this lawfare against journalists and activists, but on the other hand, we're seeing in the PUK zone, and yes, there are people that are prosecuted in the PUK zone as well, but we're seeing you know, crackdowns on protests, and then the sort of co-optative reaction as well. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, I think it's quite important to understand that these parties, especially, I mean, obviously we are talking about the KDP and PUK as the two ruling party, but also it's also important, I mean, to emphasize that actually these two parties are kind of reduced themselves to the two ruling elite, so two ruling classes. And we see that actually the suppression of dissent takes different forms in Kurdistan. I mean, in the beginning, obviously, I mean, they were not very powerful in order to implement some kind of legal means in order to prosecute, for example, journalists or citizens or whatever. So we saw that actually some journalists were either beaten up or assaulted, or some of them were killed, obviously. So these kind of practices usually performed by a kind of power that actually has no legal legitimacy in the system, and that's one point. The other point is when we see that actually the suppression of dissent in the case of, for example, I mean, being discussed, I mean, the Badinan detainees, we see that actually they use a legal kind of excuses in order to either jail them or sentence them. And these legal means actually, most of them are unfounded. So we saw that actually it was basically a short trial rather than any kind of a real trial where cross-examination can happen. But basically, I mean, what happened, it was only a short trial and they didn't have any kind of right to a fair trial. But also, I mean, in terms of protests, so one point is about whether actually the authorities co-opting the opposition. So, I mean, we have problems with the opposition, obviously. I mean, opposition after after 1991, opposition was not formed as a kind of a unity or a single association, but the opposition was formed as a kind of space, which I was trying to explain in the first question, that actually this public space was working as a form of opposition, as a form of civil society that actually counters the authority, counters the political power. So this kind of opposition obviously formed after 2005 and 2009 in the formation of Goran movement as a kind of organized opposition. But this organized opposition, obviously, we saw that this organized opposition also kind of gone into dissolution and also co-opted mainly by KDP as the kind of now the kingmaker in the KRG. So this kind of co-optation is actually one of the strategies of a power that's more of an authoritarian power rather than a democratic power. So the authoritarian nature of power is actually trying to use even elections in order to win over the emotions and the opposition as well. So to bring opposition into its camp. So this is one of the problems actually that's happening. But one I think other problem is that why, for example, I mean the KDP and PUK are trying to eliminate that public space in which not only journalists, but also, I mean, citizens at large, obviously the society at large, try to express their opinions and try to assemble and try to associate with each other in order to express their discontent and criticize the power. I mean, the whole point of when we talk about freedom of association, freedom of expression and other kinds of freedom is actually the right of citizen to exercise those freedoms. So if we have the freedom of expression and freedom of speech in the constitution, either we are talking about the Iraqi constitution, because actually so far we haven't got any constitution in the Kurdistan region after 30 years of rule, which is kind of shocking. I think, I mean, the existence of those kind of freedoms means nothing if you don't have the right to exercise them. So once you come to exercise them, then we see that actually what's happening in Kurdistan, and obviously, I mean, in Iraq as well, that you are either detained, jailed, imprisoned, and basically, I mean, the authorities use the illegitimate forces in order to counter this kind of protest, this kind of opposition. And don't forget that also, I mean, protest is a right of citizens in any kind of system that claims to be democratic or claims to be based on representative elections. So because people, when they go to vote, so they go to vote for their representatives in order actually to create a system that's those rights can be exercised.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And one of the things that, and Dastan, you had noted that there's sort of a perversion of the language of democracy. When you read Kurdistan region law, like I'm thinking of the journalism law, most of these rights or most of these laws start out with like some platitudes about rights being absolute, and then they go on to qualify those rights throughout the rest of the bill. In the case of the journalism law, for example, it says that journalists have full right to write whatever they want, so long as it doesn't, essentially, so long as it doesn't, it's not harassment or it's defamation. But the way that this is analyzed is, well, is the person actually a journalist? And the way that they analyze that is, do they belong to the journalism union, which is established by the Kurdistan regional government, and it's almost fully controlled by the political parties? Do they belong to an established outlet, which is, again, media outlets are controlled by the parties? Do they adhere to journalistic ethics, which again are defined by the political parties? So yes, the right is there, but what does the right consist of? And the answer is, it really doesn't consist of that much. So like you said, Dara, you can't really effectuate the right, even though the government claims that the right exists. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is about foreign interference. And we hear a lot from KRG officials that there's a foreign hand responsible for stirring up dissent in the region. And this is understandable, and it's in a way somewhat credible, because there isn't foreign interference in the region. There's a PKK presence. There's a more expansive Turkish interference in the region as well. What role do these regional actors and non-state actors like the PKK actually play in civil society and people's demands? And how does it shape the government's response to protests? And I'm going to ask you first, Dastan, because you had just written a paper on the Turkish intervention.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's ironic that they get this accusation, because pretty much the whole history of both KDP and PUK is about winning internal Kurdish wars by getting external powers to support them. Just to make that point in the very beginning, especially in the 90s, it was a dark chapter of how far some parties and some individuals would go to get support from foreign powers to crack down people in the Kurdish political sphere that they would not like. So it's ironic that they make this claim. With the PKK as an external actor, it's hard, because the PKK, and this is my main point also in the paper that you are talking about, is the PKK is a transnational armed organization, armed and political organization. There are PKK fighters that come from majority Kurdish cities in Turkey, but there are also PKK fighters that come from the far south, from cities like Khanaqin or Kifri or Kalar. It's not something unfrequent, and it's kind of, they're trying to frame it in a way that it doesn't belong to this conflict, but it does belong to it. It also belongs to the region. We shouldn't forget that part of the 2013 peace negotiations between the Turkish state and the PKK, where also the Kurdistan regional government took up a great role in helping in these negotiations, was that the PKK should withdraw through the Kandil Mountains. So for the KDP leadership to be like, why are they in the Kandil Mountains? Well, then you should have probably in 2014 said, we're not really happy with this. But back then and this is also another point on legalizing and delegalizing things all of a sudden. Like in 2014, everyone was perfectly fine with having negotiations with the PKK to put an end to this military conflict that has taken thousands and thousands of lives. And now this precise points of this agreement are criminalized. So that's kind of the thing. At the end of the day, I think a very dangerous example is set in this point. You're talking about also examples like also right now with the Badinan detainees, where there was a meeting in the US consulate that is taken as evidence for some foreign interference with them and I don't know what. And also in the with the protests in the Kurdistan region from December, they often said this is PKK stirring up protests. Well, first of all, even if there was not a PKK, there would be people that are not happy with the situation, because literally people have most real income, have no possibility to live. Let's not even talk about unemployment among youth and all that kind of stuff. But second of all, the dangerous precedent here is that in this case, you're talking about someone receiving money from a foreign NGO from an American NGO to make services, to make a report or to give information, which is some of the, like, this is really some of the most normal stuff that is happening in the Kurdistan region, many other countries. I mean, making a report for an NGO, for a foreign organization on something, whether it's about the situation in prison or the situation in IDP camps or whatever, is the most normal thing. And to get paid for it is the most normal thing. If this is a crime, and if this is considered espionage, then, you know, it's, you know, I would like suggest people that are from other countries or that engage in, you know, research in the region, or that engage in humanitarian labor where they have to gather knowledge and information to make these reports, and who get paid for this, to maybe get out of the country, because that is dangerous then. This is a really dangerous precedent in this case. So to sum it up, it's ironic that they talk about foreign interference because they've always supported foreign interference if it was okay for them. And it's just a dangerous precedent, because where are we drawing the line? What is foreign interference? What is espionage? What is, you know, corruption also? What is like taking, you know, dirty money from some government? And what is just like doing a job for a foreign NGO, which is, you know, very common, obviously, in Kurdistan region.
Yeah, thank you. Dara, did you have anything to add to that?
The point I would like to add to what Dastan discussed is actually these kind of accusations of foreign interference, especially in a region like Kurdistan region, is completely so unrealistic that probably, I mean, no one would believe that, because I mean, Kurdistan region itself, actually, the external powers are freely moving and exercising and having their own consulates and even their intelligence services, like especially, I mean, the regional powers. So this is a kind of politics, which is blaming others for your own failures. That's what actually the KRG is doing. And in order to talk about external interference and for example, accusing activists and journalists of being spy, I don't think, I mean, that would actually convince anyone in the Kurdistan region, and even actually outside Kurdistan region. And this will add more trouble and actually more problems to the Kurdistan region's own problems, because I mean, Kurdistan region and the KRG as a governance entity has so many problems that it cannot actually do its job properly. So I think, I mean, this kind of accusations and this kind of interference of external powers has no legitimacy and has no any kind of point that we can actually discuss in the sense of a rational debate. So I think that's what I want to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Dara. And by the way, when I say credible, I think that the parties believe that you know, that it will be accepted as credible because of the presence of other foreign actors in the region. Not that these accusations are necessarily credible. We know that part of most of the case in chief against the 5 defendants was not based on their PKK connections, but based on their work with foreign consulates and investigating human rights violations and that kind of a thing. But yes, thank you for that. We only have a little bit of time left for this discussion. And by the way, I want to encourage everybody, please, you know, send us your questions in the chat. We'd be happy to address them in the next half hour. But quickly, I want to talk about this budget law has just passed. And as we know, a lot of the grievances between, you know, a lot of citizens' grievances have been related to the lack of salaries paid on time or in full, and the poor quality of public services. So with the passage of this budget, do you expect that this tension between the citizens and the government will decrease, or will it have any effect whatsoever? And I'll start with you, Dara.
Right. Okay. So obviously, I mean, this kind of negotiation between the KRG and the central government in Baghdad has been going on for quite a long time. And I think one could probably trace it back to when the KRG and probably more specifically the KDP actually decided to sell Kurdistan's oil and gas separately and independently, basically on the basis of a claim that they want to create an independent economy to pave the way for the referendum for an independent Kurdistan. But obviously that backfired and didn't work, not only because actually the referendum was, hit a hard wall, but also because actually even before the referendum, the KRG, because of its own corruption and mismanagement and the kind of system of nepotism and the clientelist network that actually the KRG is based on, they couldn't actually feed the people of Kurdistan. They couldn't provide for people based on that rupture with the central government from 2014 until 2017 when the referendum happened. And obviously that continued until today, when we see that actually the KRG is kind of reaching an agreement with Baghdad in order for Baghdad to send the KRG's share of the budget. But that's all. It's, I mean, vague. We don't know actually the KRG share of the federal budget, and we don't know exactly how the KRG will abide by the commitments that has been laid out in the draft. Sorry, not in the draft, but in the budget law, in terms of handing the oil and handing the other revenues. Even with that, I mean, some people will argue that actually it's not handing the oil, but it's handing the revenue instead. So I mean, there are so many details in that bill, in that law, in order to be laid out, in order to understand how it works. And I think that at least the public actually don't know exactly how that works, and whether actually the central government will send the salary of the employees. I mean, obviously, I mean, when we talk about the employees, I mean, that's another issue, that we are talking about the corruption of the system in the Kurdistan region and in the Iraq. But at the time being, I mean, we are talking about in the context of the Kurdistan region. I mean, when you have these bloated public employees and you cannot basically give them the salaries, that's not because actually you have all these people. It's actually you don't have all these people, and because you have been running the system on a very perverse way of running the system. A perverse way of how to build the economy of the region. And I think obviously if the budget, if the money comes to Kurdistan and people get their salaries, obviously that would alleviate some of the problems that people are suffering and have been facing for actually a couple of years at least. But that doesn't mean actually everything will be smooth and everything will be solved. Because I mean, the problem which I see is not the problem of only paying the public employees' salaries and getting their money. Obviously, that's a huge issue for people, because there are many people who are actually living off that. But the issue is how to fix that broken system that exists in the Kurdistan region. And I think to fix that broken system is actually, there's a need for a radical project. There's a need for a radical thinking and action in order to fix that system, which I think that system is actually going towards a more authoritarian practice in the Kurdistan region, represented by the KDP and PUK, obviously. And this authoritarian practice is actually not serving the KRG itself and not serving the people, because people at the end of the day will turn to the kind of the pressure groups and the pressure civil society that the KRG cannot sustain itself. So I think for some temporary, it's a kind of a temporary solution. We can look at the budget that has been solved, but it's not a solution for what has been going on in the Kurdistan region for 30 years.
Thank you for that, Dara. And I think I'm going to move to the Q&A now, because it looks like we're about due for that. So this one, I think I'm going to field to you, Dastan. Sirwan Kakarash asks, thank you for your question, by the way, Kak Sirwan. You mentioned the role of diaspora Kurds. How effective have they been in influencing the foreign policy of their respective Western governments vis-a-vis the KRI's handling of civil society organizations? And if I might add to that, Dastan, do you think that, you know, these diaspora advocacy groups are advocating for the same things that civil society organizations are advocating for in Kurdistan?
It's really hard, because it depends on what diaspora organizations you look at. If you have political parties that for decades have been lobbying in major capitals of the West with the Kurdish cause, using the Kurdish cause, but at the same time, they have the material possibilities to be like, get a monopoly on representation of Kurds, then we have a difficult situation, quite frankly. I mean, there are capitals in this world where one specific party is doing all kinds of, you know, foreign representation. Well, that's not Kurdish representation, you know, and often it's, you know, very focused on one specific part of Kurdistan, and often that is, you know, the Kurdistan region in Iraq. There is some development. I see, really, especially in the last 10 years, especially during everything happening, you know, with the rise of HDP in Turkey, with the Rojava revolution, with oppositional movement, you know, gaining momentum in southern Kurdistan. Also, we should not forget with the great movements in the protests of Kurds in Iran in 2018 and 19, I see that there is a lot of momentum where Kurds from different parts of the Kurdish regions come together in diaspora. They're working together. They're trying to find common interests, trying to bargain for a common interest in a, you know, very transnational sense. And I think that it has a big future, and that is really needed, because that is what these oppositional groups are counting for. And the prisoners, the Badinan prisoners, which are sharing their cell with more than 100 people, 4 of whom are COVID-19 positive, they are waiting for this kind of people to take over the role in the diaspora. But clearly there is a class issue, because there are people that have much, much more money when it comes to that. There are people that have much more access in, you know, Washington, in Berlin, in London, that, you know, have specific background, have specific resources, and they can just do stuff and push buttons that other people can't. But I believe their momentum is over, because some things are not believed anymore that were believed until 2017.
Thank you for that. Dara, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't have.
Great. Just looking through the questions. Hiwa Heder has an interesting comment that I wanted to bring up. He said, in my view, political opposition, civil society, and protest movements need to be examined somewhat separately. They've been subject to different structural influences, and they in turn influence politics differently in Kurdistan. I don't suggest that the boundaries are clear cut, but for the sake of analysis, we need to study them each on their own. The blurred relationship between political opposition and civil society and protest movements in Kurdistan proved to have adverse consequences for civil society. Now a great part of civil society is either in the shade of political opposition or ruling parties. Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment and an important one, because clearly not all of civil society is oppositional. and opposition is often regarded in sort of organized opposition by the dominant parties, which has a negative connotation and has an effect on how they deal with this. So we hear constantly from the political parties that it's fine if you organize, but so long as you're not being politically influenced or oppositional. So yes, I think that's an important comment, and one that we should parse these things out as well. So did anybody have a comment to add to that?
Yes, if I can just comment a little bit, I think that's an interesting and good point actually by Mr. Hiwa Khadir. And I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with him. Obviously, I mean, there are some analytical distinction that needs to be drawn actually between public sphere, civil society, and street protests. But that's obviously, it's a kind of a scholarly discussion. What exactly we mean by civil society as a term, and in many cases actually, civil society has been used as a kind of a counter space to the authority. That comes actually down at least from the time of the Soviet Union, where in the socialist bloc, civil society emerged in some of those countries as a kind of a space where society or political communities could actually exercise their own kind of political practices vis-a-vis the government or the authority. And in Kurdistan, it's mainly seen as associations, civil society associations. So for example, NGOs are seen as civil society associations. So civil society basically reduced to associations rather than to this sphere as a kind of a neutral sphere between the authority and the society or political communities or even communities. But when we talk about public sphere, I mean, public sphere actually, or public space, contains street protests, social movements, media in their different formats, like, I mean, social media as well, obviously, I mean, digital communication. So all these kind of communicative practices. So, I mean, for my part, actually, I prefer to use the public space or the public sphere rather than the civil society, because that probably in some cases would create some kind of confusion.
Thank you for that, and for clarifying that point as well. It's an interesting addendum to this, and it's worth exploring some more at another time. But I did want to go to this question fielded by Renwar Najin, and he asked, and this was something I wanted to get to if we had time, considering Goran's huge decline and the disappointment of so-called other opposition parties like New Generation and Islamic parties, what can we expect from the next elections? And both Iraqi early elections and the Kurdistan election in 2022. Will a low turnout and boycott serve the ruling parties or hurt their legitimacy? So I want to go to Dastan first on this, and I'll go to you, Dara.
I wish it was like that, I have to say. I wish it was about legitimacy. I don't think any of these parties care about legitimacy. I don't think they care about any, latent kind of construct of legitimacy that is somehow backing them. The two biggest parties of the Kurdistan region are armed parties. They have arms, like they can defend themselves. They don't need legitimacy. They don't need anyone supporting them at the end of the day. And to a specific point, they don't even need a good budget or something like that. Like they are going to survive until a really long point. And I have to say, I have a very grim outlook, both for the elections this year and also the elections, the parliamentary elections later than on in Kurdistan region, because these, there is just a huge political apathy, especially of the young people that are making the majority of the country. And you know, you could not be disappointed in them for being apathetic, because there is no space where people can really engage. There is no space where people can really get into stuff. And also, I mean, what are you voting for? I mean, political parties, political opinions, political ideologies, it has almost no meaning anymore. I mean, you're in a country where you have the Iraqi Communist Party, you know, allying with Muqtada Sadr. Like, I mean, ideologies are only a name anymore. So I think it's a huge crisis of what do parties even mean? What do ideologies even mean? How are you even, you know, bringing a youthful nation to, you know, be able to really have their fate in their own hands and to give a vote to a party and then expect them to represent their opinions when, you know, that is not really happening. So I have to say, I think that it will be really low turnout, extremely low turnout, also with the, you know, new biometric system in Iraq and all that stuff and the registering. I think that will also push down the turnout, and I think it will not hurt anyone's legitimacy because no one cares about legitimacy.
Dara, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, I think this is a kind of a question which hanging over every Kurdish citizen, and also, I mean, even in Iraq, what's going to happen in the next election, whether actually people will go and vote. And one thing is probably different in this election is that actually the kind of the electoral system. So the electoral system, I mean, for this Iraqi election is different because, I mean, independent people can elect themselves and become part of the political process. I mean, there are 2 points which need to be explained. Whether we think actually elections can change the political process in Kurdistan. The second thing is whether actually, if that's the case, yes, then going to vote is an important thing, and also makes a difference. Especially if the electoral system is changed. I mean, so far in the Kurdistan region, actually the electoral system hasn't been changed. So we don't have that kind of optimistic view of what's going to happen. But I think one thing is important. I mean, I'm sure, I mean, everybody probably had that kind of feeling. And also, I mean, we don't have to forget, I mean, the 2018 election in Kurdistan, actually or in Iraq as well, I mean, the turnout was very, very low. I mean, like 50% the turnout, so which is very, very low. And this actually a kind of indication how people are disillusioned with the political parties. So basically, I mean, in the Kurdistan region, at the moment, we don't see any kind of opposition, real opposition, which is happening in Kurdistan and Ranin. And the only opposition, if we talk about, obviously, Goranis is no longer an opposition force. And the new generation is also very kind of dispersed. It cannot actually collect all the kind of oppositional forces. So maybe, I mean, one way actually to dislocate the power of the KDP and PUK is actually is to change the electoral system in Kurdistan, and also not to vote for them, not to give them the vote. So that might not change. As Dastan said, I mean, they have the military power. That will not obviously change the whole system, but at least, I mean, that will change some kind of the game. The political game that's actually at the moment is running in the Kurdistan region.
Thank you for that, Dara. I just want to mention that we're running a few minutes over, and we'll we'll continue to discuss until about 2:45. So stay tuned. But yeah, I just had a couple of comments for that. I think you bring up an important point, Dara, is that there are differences between the Kurdistan region electoral system and the federal electoral system. Also, it seems like the federal elections are often used as sort of like a monitor for how the regional elections will go. So in this case, you have early elections. There isn't as much of a there's not as much of a that kind of value attached to it this time. But one of the things that was interesting when I was looking at the International Republican Institute survey is that it seems like what you were saying about the Kurdish public not having as much of an interest in this new electoral system seems to show up in the data too. While the rest of Iraq seems to be, fairly optimistic that this new electoral system will introduce some change, particularly with opening the floor to new parties. The Kurdistan region populace doesn't seem to believe that as much, and they seem to be less optimistic. Also, you have a higher rate of registration, voter registration in the Kurdistan region, but a lower expected turnout for this election too. So we'll see what happens on that front as well. Let's see. Just looking for some additional questions here. Sirwan Kakarash again asks, is there any idea of the percentage of civil society organizations that are organic in their origins, development, and their financial underpinnings? Kakdara, I think I'm going to field that one to you.
Sorry, is the question about the number of civil society organizations?
Civil society organizations that are organic in their origins.
Yeah, I mean there's a huge number actually of civil society organization in Kurdistan region. I think it's about 4,000, something like this. And also, the problem is most of them are not functioning, are not working. They are only there by name, and just they registered themselves as civil society organization in the list of civil society organizations. But also, that's not very, not very crucial in terms of as to see that as an indication of the power of civil society in Kurdistan. So that doesn't indicate any kind of existence of a powerful civil society. And also, civil society, it's quite difficult, to pin down in Kurdistan, what do you mean by civil society? As I try to say that in the beginning. But also, what's important is that actually seems to be, it's not only in Kurdistan, but also in the wider Middle East region. It's actually people are resorting to street politics, to protests and demonstrations in order to express their discontent, their oppositional views and actions. So that's a very important space where people try to cling to. But apparently what we see by the KDP and the PUK, especially by the KDP, is actually the colonization of that public space. By colonizing that public space, people, citizens have no right to claim the streets. So even for a peaceful demonstration in Erbil and Duhok, it's not allowed. And that's how those people actually are arrested, and they have been behind the bars for now almost 8 months or maybe more. We see that this kind of practice that's actually been exercised by the KDP and the PUK as trying to colonize that space, which is very important in terms of having a healthy civil society.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's very difficult to determine, when we talk about independent civil society organizations, what exactly do we mean by that? And, their sources of revenue. Well, I think if you're talking about, some of these groups that have formed outside the political parties, outside of the unions, outside of the syndicates on Facebook and things like that, it's very difficult to trace funding, if there is any external sources of funding. And also, it seems to be that the activists are being prosecuted exactly for receiving funding, either for, not necessarily for organizing activities, but for, receiving, for example, an honorarium to do an investigation or something like that. So I would assume that it's, if we're talking about organizations that are organizing outside of the official channels or party channels, then it would be very limited as far as that goes. But that's something to follow up on as well. Muhammad Rasul asks, do you think there will be a violent revolution in Iraqi Kurdistan because the new generation is disappointed? Well, I'm not sure about violent revolution, but do you think that even with all these crackdowns, it seems like there are two opinions on this, right? With the crackdowns and the prosecutions, on one hand, you would think that it would chill speech, it would discourage protests, but on the other hand, it could also inflame public opinion as well. I'm wondering, what effect do you think that this has? Do we see more violence? Do we see increased demonstrations? Do we see different ways of organizing as activists try to mitigate these barriers? And I'll start with Dastan.
I didn't hear it. You meant me, or?
Yes, if you could maybe explain a little bit how, because Muhammad Rasul asks, do you think that there will be more violence? And I was saying that there might be two different ways of looking at this. On one hand, the additional legal barriers and the crackdowns might discourage organization and collective action. But on the other hand, it might also inflame public opinion as well and lead to more violence. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. What's the outlook for opposition?
I mean, the Kurdistan region is like 8 million people. And I say this often, but when you compare it to Iraq and protest movement in Iraq, Iraq's like the rest of Iraq, excluding Kurdistan region, is like 30 million people. And you might have a lot of militias there, but you just have a huge amount of people that can just, go on the street and organize and do something. And you have cities like Baghdad and Basra, they are like, millions of people living there. And so it's just, we're dealing with different quantities here. But for the Kurdistan region, it's really hard because like controlling 8 million people that are by now in a much more urbanized space, more and more of them moving to the cities, not always being in the outskirts. So by being in the cities, being more easy to control and more easy to observe, it's really, really hard. I mean, you gather 8 people in some place in Hawlid and you make a protest with them, and you can be sure that, Asaish even knows before you're there and you're gathering. That's a situation. Like, I mean, it's a very intense situation of oppression. And also, I mean, no one is talking about the protests anymore. And it's not so long ago. Like the December protests, like, costing 8 lives, the youngest being a 13-year-old boy, is not worth a mention anymore. Like, so, and it's just like a huge media system also. Like, I mean, for 8 million people, I have to repeat this, for 8 million people having so many channels that are like channeling so much disinformation. And I have to be honest, like just stupid content. I mean, this is just like a targeted, targeted approach of completely depoliticizing public and like making people very passive, and especially young people very passive. And you mix that type of, media sphere and social media sphere with a climate of oppression and observation and permanent, pressure, is going to be hard. So I would say either is going to continue with this type of this type of silence, if you could say, or it's going to be very messy at some point, and there's going to be some really, really big issue going on, especially with street protests. But also, I think that in the end is depending on the people that are supporting this regime, because at the end of the day, it is a it's a regime that has a lot of money, but it's still a landlocked, semi-autonomous region in a failed state. and it has people that is supporting them, and that's why they are strong. So for me, thinking about the future of this regime and the future of people that are against this regime is going to depend a lot on, quite frankly, what Ankara is going to look like in the next years. I think that that's also where the kingmaker is and where the situation is decided upon. Yeah, how strong some forces in Erbil are going to be in the future.
Yeah, I think that opens up a whole nother discussion, but it's something that we might come back to at another time. Dara, do you have anything to add to this?
I don't know if you have time. Probably you have
About
like
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Hmm.
I mean, I agree with most of what Dastan said, but probably I will have a different take, saying that actually violence is a kind of is a kind of a characteristic of those societies, Kurdistan included. So violence is a recurrent phenomenon that actually will happen, either obviously from the authorities or even from people, because as we discussed, I mean, earlier, street protests are one of the main venues that people and society find as the most effective. So for that reason, even though actually the December protests were silenced and didn't spread to other cities, but that could happen again. And we shouldn't forget that actually after 1991, protests have been happening, I mean, for continuously. During the 90s, actually the protests were against the civil war that was between KDP and PUK, and then happened after even the fall of Saddam in 2006 and 2008. So it continued until a few months ago. So I think that actually will not stop. And I think it's quite important, actually, these kind of street protests, but as long as they are not violent, but there's no guarantee. I mean, it's very possible actually to change the system through peaceful protests that actually the Kurdistan region may not have experienced before. Because I mean, in Kurdistan, either we had an armed struggle against the Iraqi regimes in the past, or we had these kind of street protests which actually didn't last for a long time. I mean, obviously we have the February 2011 protest in Suleimani, which was one of the big protests that lasted for quite a good time, for more than 2-3 months. So that was a kind of an example, probably if it maybe in the future that could happen again, and maybe not in one city but in other cities, and that's I see as a kind of a real pressure on the system actually to change. Apart from that, actually we have the other avenues like elections, but elections, as we said, probably is not that effective.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think one of the questions, and you mentioned the protest movements in the 90s, a lot of, if we're talking about is violence likely, well, violence is already happening, but it's sporadic, it's kind of low level, but we're talking about organized violence, I think is what Crossroads is referring to, which seems kind of unlikely considering, you know, the fact that the parties that are currently in power have monopolized a lot of sources of funding. You know, in the 1990s, you had the Shura movements, which had tried to get in on some of these funding channels. You know, some of them were armed, but they failed to accomplish what they set out to do, which was to some of them at least was to undermine the Kurdistan Front and its you know, consolidation of power over the local government. So yeah, I don't think I'm expecting that, especially with the division of power the way it is in the Kurdistan region right now, but you know, possibly more nonviolent protests. But again, you know, you have a problem with the division of power, and we saw this with the organization in Badinen, the crackdowns there. Some of those activists are now organizing in Soleimani, but it's not a broad, you know, cross-regional movement, which I think is what would be needed to really change the system in the Kurdistan region, because these two parties can always sort of, divide these movements. So I think with that, we have come to a conclusion. I want to thank everybody for showing up, Dr. Dara Salam, Dastan Jasim, and thank you to Uzay Yildirim for organizing this and the Center for Kurdish Progress. And thank you to everybody for sending us your questions. And I hope to meet with you all again sometime soon. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.